may be seated, thank you.
Of course, I don't start coughing until my turn, right?
Yes, that's the way it goes.
I know.
All right, good. When you're ready, Mr. Martin.
Thank you. Your Honor, counsel. One word. One word that sums up the events on January 13th, 2014. One word. Retaliation. Retaliation. The action of harming someone because they have harmed oneself. One word. Retaliation. Throw popcorn on me, will you? Bang! Retaliation. In the state of Florida, we have what's commonly known as the standard ground law. That's the vernacular for it. Mr. Escobar summed it up at the end of his closing. However, a person is justified in the use of deadly force and does not have a duty to retreat if he or she reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or herself or another, or to prevent the imminent commission of a forceful felony. In Florida, it's the defense that has the burden of going forward and proving by a preponderance of the evidence that Mr. Reeves is entitled to immunity for the shooting and killing of Chad Olson. It's an affirmative defense. It's not met by, what if we had this, what if we had this, speculating that if we had certain evidence it would prove this. They have to meet the burden with the facts that are in fact available. This is not a trial. This is not casting reasonable doubt on the state's case, as it would have been if the state had the burden to prove its case beyond the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. This is an opportunity for Mr. Reeves, through his counsels, to come in and prove affirmatively by a preponderance of the evidence, I am entitled to immunity. So what is the issue before the court? The court, in making its decision, is an objective standard. The standard requires the court to determine whether, based on circumstances as they appeared to the defendant when he or she acted, a reasonable and prudent person situated in the same circumstances and knowing what the defendant knew would have used the same force as did the defendant. So, what did Mr. Reeves believe was about to happen that was so undesirable that it required the use of deadly force to prevent it? Now, Judge, in conducting the analysis whether Mr. Reeves killed Mr. Olson to prevent his own death or great bodily harm, or to prevent a forcible felony, doesn't matter. The analysis is the same. What was the undesirable event that was about to happen that Mr. Reeves reasonably believed it required the use of deadly force to stop? To answer that question, Judge, I suggest that you have to look and examine the facts as testified by the witnesses, the evidence collected from the scene, and Mr. Reeves' various statements. And we start with, what do we know that is absolute? One is that Mr. Chad Olson is dead. We don't have to go any further than that. That's an absolute. But there are two other facts that are extremely important to this court's consideration that requires no analysis whatsoever. We know absolutely. We know that Mr. Olson had a bag of popcorn. We know that Mr. Reeves had a pistol. There's no question about it. We know that the popcorn bag was tossed by Mr. Olson. We know that Mr. Reeves pulled his firearm and shot Mr. Olson. Those are the facts that are undisputed. There's no question about that. We don't have to go any further than that analysis. The other issues takes a little more looking into, a little more analysis. And what I like to do, Judge, is I like to go through those salient issues that the state feels that the court should consider in determining whether or not Mr. Reeves was in fact reasonable. And let me first just list them out for you, so you kind of get an idea of where I'm going. And then we're going to talk about each one individually. What started the conflict between Mr. Reeves and Mr. Olson? And more importantly, who kept it going? Next one. Was a cell phone used by Mr. Olson as a blunt object to cause harm to Mr. Reeves? The next one. Was Mr. Reeves hit in the face by Mr. Olson with his fist? The next one. Was Nicole Olson trying or failing to restrain her husband, Chad Olson? The next one. Was there an escalating pattern of violence by Mr. Olson against Mr. Reeves? The next one. Was Mr. Reeves' eyeglasses knocked askew on his face? The next one. Was Mr. Olson over his seat back when Mr. Reeves shot him? The next one. What was the conduct of Mr. Olson after the toss of the popcorn? The next one. What was Mr. Olson's body position when he was shot? And finally, Judge, I'm suggesting the court has to consider what was Mr. Reeves' state of mind when he shot Mr. Olson. Over the next hour or so, we're going to explore each of those factual issues. And then I'm going to combine them for the court and put together the analysis to assist the court in making its own determination as to whether or not Mr. Reeves was justified in shooting Mr. Olson. And what I would like to do is first start with what started the conflict between Mr. Reeves and Mr. Olson, and who kept it going. Now, we've had testimony about where everybody was sitting. Mr. Olson is just to the row in front and to Mr. Reeves' right. Mr. Reeves' wife, Vivian, is sitting right behind Mr. Olson. Mrs. Olson is sitting right in front of Mr. Reeves. We know where the players were. But what was going on after Mr. Reeves sat down with his popcorn? The previews were playing. The lights had been dimmed. People were still allowed by Cobb Theater to come into the theater while the previews were going. People were allowed to talk. But there was an announcement, hey, put away your cell phones. Now, Mr. Reeves took it upon himself the very first time to make contact with Mr. Olson. Before that time, Mr. Olson and Mr. Reeves had no relationship whatsoever. They didn't know each other. They just happened to be within 3 feet of each other in a movie theater. But it's Mr. Reeves who began to change the environment that he found himself in. He contacted Mr. Olson, and regardless what the words are, I'm not going to split hairs would you please turn it off in a very cuddly fashion, or demanding turn it off and he was rude? It doesn't matter. What matters for this analysis, that upon that initial contact, Mr. Olson made it known to Mr. Reeves under no certain terms, leave me alone, without going to all of the language that we heard. Leave me alone. Don't bother me. Do not bother me. So what did Mr. Reeves do? You remember Mr. Escobar said, and I've read instead, knowing what the defendant knew at the time. Well, now he knew that Mr. Olson was not the friendly type. He didn't want his attention. He was rude. He was even hostile. At that point, there wasn't words of threat like, I'm going to stab you in the heart. You know what I mean. There was some cussing. Clearly letting Mr. Reeves know that maybe this guy doesn't want my attention. Now, Mr. Reeves, wanting to have the movie experience of the trailers that he paid for, took it upon himself, knowing that Mr. Olson was still messing around with his phone, whatever he was doing. It was so bothersome to Mr. Reeves that he would interrupt his viewing pleasure of the previews in order to take advantage of confronting Mr. Olson. Please turn off your phone. Please turn off your phone. Do I have to get the manager? I'm going to go out to the movie manager. I'm going to come back in. I'm going to sit back down. And all those previews were so important to me, I just wasted 4 minutes of preview watching time. But that's what he did. And that was his explanation. I wanted that movie experience. Those previews were important. How many times did Mr. Reeves contact Mr. Olson? Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The second time, he clearly knew that Mr. Olson did not want his contact. The third time, he really should have known that Mr. Olson did not want his contact. Now, what I'd like to do, Judge, is begin my analysis. And as we go through this, each point that I want to make, I'm going to be referring to certain segments of the video. I kind of know where the breaks are. You do too. And there's some significant breaks. We're all familiar with where they are. But I want to show you what we can see in the video. I'm not going to play it straight through. I just want to point out those salient features of the video that you can then use in your analysis. But first of all, I want to discuss with you the number of times that Mr. Reeves made contact with Mr. Olson. At 13:22:25, we see Mr. Reeves reaching towards the back seat of Mr. Olson. I want you to pay specific attention to his right hand. You can see it as I back it up and forward. You can see where his hand is. And as he extends that right hand forward on that first contact, he continues to lean over, continues to his head is almost out of the frame. Now, please remember that, because we're going to go back and I'm going to refer that when Mr. Olson is seen right before the popcorn is tossed, and I'll reference that to where you see his head, halfway in that frame. Just to give you a reference point, that's how far in Mr. Reeves encroaches upon the space of Mr. Olson. The significance of that, Judge, is when you compare that with the amount of encroachment you see when Mr. Olson tosses the popcorn. It's like night and day. Who's invading whose space? That is Mr. Reeves on the first contact. Now, I want you to watch, again, right down here, his right hand where I have the cursor. See his elbow is bent, and as he leans back, does he push off the seat of the back of Mr. Olson? That's for your determination. I just pointed out to you so you can make your own determination. But that is the first contact with Mr. Olson that begins the environment that Mr. Reeves created. He settles back into his seat. And there are a little bit of gaps here and there, but the next contact, he leans in, not quite as far. We're at 13:22:35 on the second contact. And if you would look again, right where I have the cursor, look at his right hand. Again, for your own determination, is Mr. Reeves pushing off on the back of the seat of Mr. Olson. And that's for your determination, Judge. He settles back into his seat, and we know the dialogue has been testified to. Mr. Escobar went over it. Puts his popcorn down. Do I have to go get the manager? And he gets up and leaves. Now, what was said, we've had the testimony. Some people call it a rude manner, turn it off. Some people said it was a pleasant manner. Would you please turn it off? But whatever it was, Mr. Olson made it absolutely clear that he didn't want any contact with Mr. Reeves. Mr. Reeves left that theater with that knowledge, knowing that he left an individual there that he had contact with 3 times, that was a little bit agitated, and now he's going to go complain to the manager. And that's important because we talk about what was Mr. Reeves' conduct when he came back. When he came back. The testimony of Mr. Reeves when he came back goes straight to his credibility, and at the end I'll go over the credibility issues with you of Mr. Reeves. But we begin with this statement that when he returned, as he was coming back through the aisle, for the very first time ever, we hear from Mr. Reeves that Mr. Olson gave him, I believe his words were, an agitated stare. Was that provided during the statement to law enforcement? No, it was not. But what is more important, Judge, is that when he does return, I'll speed it up. When he does return, by his own admission, the cell phone had been put away. Whatever environment that he created when he left had resolved itself. It was over. But what did he do? As he walked by, either as he walked by or just as he was sitting down, words to the fact, hey, I see you put your phone away. Now, there's been various variations of how it was said, what manner it was said, whether or not there was a please or not. But the fact remains, when he walked by, he knew that the event that he was complaining of was over. It had resolved itself. Mr. and Mrs. Olson were sitting there cuddled up watching the movie. They were having their own movie experience. But what does he do? He rekindles the hostility flames between himself and Mr. Olson. There was no reason for him whatsoever at that point to have any contact with Mr. Olson. Now, we might surmise, well, in this day and age, is it okay to have contact? Would you please do this? One contact, maybe we can see. But two or three, knowing, leave me alone, coming back, now the situation's over. What does he do? See, you put the phone away. Needling a little bit? That's for your determination, Judge. But what happens? It rekindles the flames of hostility between the two. It was over. Now Mr. Reeves has placed himself back in harm's way again by his own conduct. But you know the difference at that moment in time between Mr. Reeves and Mr. Olson and that rekindled hostile environment is that Mr. Reeves had a pistol in his pocket. The great compensator, the great equalizer. That was the knowledge that Mr. Reeves had as he walked past and sat down. The next issue, Judge, for your consideration, was a cell phone used by Mr. Olson as a blunt object to cause harm to Mr. Reeves. Now, at this point, we need to go through the analysis, and yes, I'm going to play some videos back and forth, but we're just going to the segments that, if you would take the appropriate notes, and I'll give you the frame numbers, that you can use to go back and make that determination for yourself. But one of the things that has come up is whether or not Mr. Reeves' shoes have a reflective material. And even Mr. Escobar, in his closing argument, acknowledged that there is some reflectivity to Mr. Reeves' shoes. And whether or not at the time he crosses his legs, are we seeing the reflectivity of the shoes, or we're seeing a cell phone. But I can't argue, I can't do the analysis of both of those issues at one time, so I have to pull them apart. So let's just first start with the reflectivity of the shoes, then I'll deal with the cell phone. Then I think you see when we put it together, a cell phone was never thrown. So if we could, Judge, let me take you back earlier when Mr. Reeves came into the theater. Now, it's approximately 13:19:45. Now, Mr. Reeves has just picked up his popcorn from his wife. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to concentrate where my cursor is. This is what's called critical viewing. You have to be able not to look at something frame by frame, because a movie or a video, the purpose of it is movement gives the individual frames content. Remember the example I did? If I'm just standing there with a baseball glove and a baseball, if I'm just standing there, what am I doing? But if you see a bunch of frames, I could be throwing. But that's what this is. So when you have to be able to tie the two together, and you have to be able to do the analysis to track movement along with the artifacts within the frame so that you can put content, if you will, to what you're seeing. So if you look where the cursor is, and there's a lot of movement, but now right here, Judge, I want you to consider as part of your analysis is whether or not this, you see right here, is in fact the defendant's knee moving up. And then I want you to watch right here, because we know the knee, the ankle, and the foot. If you saw right here, and I'm going to play it back and forth, and it's important that we do that. You'll see there's no little white dot and a white dot, and no little white dot and a white dot. Now, what I would like for you to do, Judge, is continue to focus on that, and as the frames progress, I'm suggesting to you that you'll see that become brighter. But that's for your own determination. As we go frame by frame by frame by frame, you take that increased brightness with the elevation if you have considered that to be his knee. And I'll go back down for you and back up. Back down, back up, and then the final cross where you see the remarks. Now, Mr. Escobar pointed out that on the inside of the shoe, there is no reflective material, but what is on the that side of the shoe are the two white bars at the heel, which are rectangular. So you can see when you do that analysis, and you do that critical view, and you track the movement of the white object with the movement of Mr. Reeves' leg, he's bringing, for your determination, he's bringing up his right leg to cross. Judge, I did that for you so that then you can go to where we talk about the cell phone. And let me get right to the spot. There we go. Now, I need to back it up because I need to make sure that the court recalls there is a 5-minute gap between what we see here and what we see here. The court recalls that. So I didn't want to mislead the court anyway. It's not fluid. There is a gap there. But there is a gap, and then the next frame you will see, for your consideration, Mr. Olson, and again I'll refer you to the white mark. Now, what was going through that 5-second gap? We can't tell from the video. You're going to have to rely either on the witness statements or Mr. Reeves. But right now, let's just do the analysis with the video. We have Mr. Olson in that position. You can make your own determination what that position is. But you recall the testimony of Mr. Reeves to Detective Proctor that after I came and sat down, he mentioned, I see you turned off the cell phone. What did Mr. Reeves say? he turned in his seat and said, you remember that? I only point that out for your own consideration as to whether or not exactly what position Mr. Olson is in. But we're going to do the same analysis, Judge, with the white mark. And if we place movement along with each frame, you can see it's visible and then it's not. It's visible and then it's not. As we come down a frame, another frame, frame, you have to take into consideration everything that you are viewing, including whether or not you believe that this area right there is Mr. Reeves' knee. And that's for your determination, Judge. You can make your own. I'm just pointing out where you should look. You see the white reflection now becomes back. And again, the analysis on the first one was lighter, brighter, brighter, brightest. This one's going down, so what do you expect to see? Brighter, not so bright, not so bright. As it comes down, so when you take into consideration and you track the movement of what you can determine for yourself, whether or not that is the leg of Mr. Reeves, as he uncrosses his legs, because if your legs are crossed and you're going to lean forward, you can't lean forward to the extent that you did unless you put your legs down back on the floor. And then what does he do? We're at 13:26:26. As Mr. Escobar pointed out, we don't see a throwing motion, and that doesn't mean it didn't occur because we have the 5-second gap. But let's talk about common sense now. Just good old common sense. It is alleged, and this is approximately 12 seconds before Mr. Reeves pulls his pistol and shoots Mr. Olson. 12 seconds. Mr. Olson has an iPhone 5. I'm not sure if it's an S or not. It has value, hundreds of dollars, back in 2014. It has your personal data on it. It's how you communicate. It's almost like our own little mini computer in our back pocket nowadays. Common sense. Are you going to take that cell phone that you walk around with in your hand all the time, that is precious to you, that means something to you, and then toss it towards another individual that you do not know, that is hostile towards you? Would you? Would you expect to get it back? Holy moly! Here, have my phone. I don't care. Common sense. Are you going to throw your cell phone that means so much to you to an individual that says, thank you, possibly, thank you, you ain't getting it back. You abandoned your property, it's now mine. You going to take that risk? Common sense? No. What was the explanation given by Mr. Reeves as to his conduct at this point? Why was he leaning forward? It's Mr. Reeves' contention that he was hit with a cell phone. So, he is taught that he should not close the distance between himself and someone that is hostile. So what does he do? We're within 18 inches of Mr. Olson. He leans forward, closing the distance. The explanation is, well, I was getting up I was leaning forward and I decided it was a bad idea. Judge, you might consider that if you find that a cell phone was thrown. If you don't find a cell phone was thrown, then what is the other explanation? Mr. Reeves, who had had 3 previous contacts with Mr. Olson, which he knew he was rude, had a 4th contact when he sat back down. Now he's leaning in for his 5th contact with an individual that he knew was very rude to him. I'm going to play this just back and forth so that you have to consider the movement. If he was hit with a cell phone, what would you expect to see? And I ask that as a rhetorical question. When someone is hit in the face, it's painful. It's almost like you kids are in school and they come up behind you and fuck you in the ear. Well, you can't help but grab your ear. You just can't help it. And you get hit in the face with a cell phone. What are you going to do? You're going to do some sort of movement to your face, something, because you just can't help it. It's a natural reaction. We don't see that with Mr. Reeves. We don't see that at all. You can see down here, he still has his popcorn in his hand. Both his hands are down. He never raises his hand up to his face, as if he was hit in the face with a blunt object, the weight of a cue ball or the weight of a baseball. We don't see that. There's got to be some pain involved. He had to know that he was hit. But we don't see that reaction. I mentioned to you that Mr. Reeves indicated that at that point where the defense team is alleging that a cell phone was thrown, that Mr. Reeves, on page 80 of his statement, tells Detective Proctor, and he turns around in his seat. And he says, I was texting my daughter or something like that. Well, that's what we have. We have situations where he confronts. At that point, he said, I see you turn off the cell phone. He sits back in the seat. Mr. Olson turns around, just like Mr. Reeves said, hey, I was texting my daughter. That's where that took place, not the throwing of a cell phone. So we're settled back in our seat. If a cell phone was thrown, it was thrown 12 seconds before the shooting. And I want the court to go ahead and make a note, because it is when Mr. Reeves says that he was hit with either a fist or a cell phone, his glasses were askew. Glasses were askew. If we believe Mr. Reeves, and that here at 13:26:25 there was a cell phone thrown, he not only doesn't go for his face like he's in pain, he leans all the way in, does whatever he has to do, with his glasses somewhere askewed on his face. And he sits like this for another 7 seconds. So Mr. Olson stands up, reaches for the popcorn, tosses some more popcorn. He draws his gun. He fires his gun, and it's not to Mr. Reeves. Sits back down in his seat, puts the gun on his lap, then he then takes his glasses and straightens them. 12 seconds with his glasses askew. I'll let you decide if that makes sense. sometimes it's better just to see things. You want to move? I'll wait for you. Sometimes it's just helpful to, once you've had the analysis, to kind of put it side by side. And if you look at 1319, and that's where the first movement of his foot takes place, you can see right here, and that's where it's in the position. And then this is where his legs are crossed. You go down to where they say the cell phone was thrown. If you look, the position at 1319 and at 1326, once you do that frame comparison and do that critical viewing by looking at the video, you can make a determination. That's it's down, down, that's when it's crossed, and when it's crossed. Are we looking at a shoe? Or are we looking at a thrown cell phone? Now, I mentioned to you, Judge, that I have to separate whether or not the shoe reflection we see is the cell phone or not. But let's assume for a moment that it's not. Then was he hit by the cell phone? What evidence do we have that he was, in fact, struck with the cell phone? It's important that we know where everybody is. So let me go back, 13, 26, 25. Now, I know we're looking at the same frames again, but the point is, Judge, is the orientation of the Mr. Reeves and Mr. Olson. Because it is alleged that at this point, a cell phone is thrown and we see the white there. Now, let's just consider that for a second. We don't know, because there's a 5-second gap, where Mr. Reeves was when it was thrown. But what did he say on the second tape statement that Proctor took of Mr. Reeves? Let me just get this other chair, Judge. He said that I was hit in the left eyebrow, my left eye, my temple hurt. My temple. Do you have a cell phone? I forgot to ask that. I apologize, ma'am. Put you on the spot like that? All right, thank you. This cell phone. Left temple. Hurt. I felt pain. I felt pain here. The orientation of the individuals. Mr. Olson is to his right. This isn't about the height of the chairs, just orientation of the people. Mr. Reeves is to his right. Where's his left temple? If he's facing forward, it's here. His left eye is here. Even if he turns this way, where's his left temple? Facing the screen. You throw the cell phone here. It's going to go straight. It's only 2 feet. There's going to be a little bit of deviation. Even if his face is looking right at Mr. Olson, his temple that he said hurt so bad that he was dazed and confused is facing the screen. Now, I'm not going to throw the cell phone. But I would bet my last dollar this is not a boomerang cell phone. You can't throw it and it come in a big looping curve like this and come back and smash him on the left side of the head. It's just not going to happen. Now throw it if you want, but I don't think you do. Is the cell phone thrown? No. The injuries to Mr. Reeves. I direct your attention to Dr. Thogmark's testimony. And he referred to this reddish mark above the eyelid. The most fragile, well, he said it was the most fragile skin on the body. It's very, very thin. And that redness can be caused by the brain. It's just constant rubbing. Like Proctor said, he was just rubbing. Before the picture was taken, he was just rubbing the eye. Right? He's wearing glasses. And what did Dr. Thogmark say? Safety glasses. They serve a purpose. If you're going to get hit in the glasses or anywhere around, but if the injury is right behind the glasses, how does that happen? Even if the frame's bent, flexible, the glass isn't. That's the whole purpose. That's why he was pounding on his glasses. You can't have this injury if the cell phone hits those glasses, even lightly, so that no marks are caused around the face. It's an intermediate object that's impenetrable. It ain't going to happen. But that's what he said was hit by the cell phone. His eyebrow, here, his temple. The glasses prevent that, and it's not a boomerang phone. The sequencing of this particular incident is critical. We have the allegation or suggestion by the defense team that the cell phone was thrown 12 to 13 seconds before the shot was fired. Now that pain occurred, daze, injury to the eye, glasses askew, all 12 or 13 seconds before. But then they go on to say, the defense team, that if it wasn't a cell phone, then he was hit with a fist. Because that's what Mr. Reeves said. He was hit with a fist or hit with a cell phone. Very quickly, Judge, look at the frames 13, 26, 25. And I invite your attention, and I know that there is a 5-second gap. We have, you remember Mr. Knox's photographs where he had the, I'll call it the yardstick, that went from Mr. Olson's chair over, is about 3 feet roughly. Was he hit by a fist at this time? Is there something to indicate that Mr. Olson could reach around from over here, from here, and come all the way around and hit him on the temple from that distance? I know Mr. Olson's is tall, long, gangly arms. No. So where was he hit? If he was hit. Let me invite your attention to another part of the surveillance video. Now, we're going to see this over and over again, but I'm playing this for a particular purpose. And we're on the next issue. Was Mr. Reeves hit in the face by Olson with his fist? If it couldn't have occurred when the Alexa cell phone occurred, then it must have occurred here if it did. And there is another 5-second gap, remember, Judge? And then for the first time we see Mr. Olson in the frame. Now, the whole purpose of watching this critically is to determine whether or not Mr. Olson's fist hit Mr. Reeves' face. So I direct your attention at 13:26:35 to critically review and follow the movement. The first movement being right here. of Mr. Olson's hand. And I'll just play it back and forth just so the court can get orientated with what we're looking at. And as the hand comes in, we don't see the left hand. Remember Corporal Hamilton's statement? He was down low, I couldn't see where his feet were, but he was propped. So he's not using his left hand. We don't see it come into the frame. So if anything, he's going to be struck with the right hand. But as I bring the frames forward, we see the grabbing of the popcorn, and the popcorn is in his hand at that point. So at that point, there was no hit to the face. He has a handful of popcorn. That's all he has. He brings it back. And then his hand comes forward with a critical view of each frame. You can discern when the popcorn is released. And you can make a determination for yourself, Judge, based on what you see in the video, where Mr. Olson's hand is in relation to Mr. Reeves. As the popcorn bag goes forward, you make your own determination, Judge. But there's nothing in his hand. I can toggle it back and forth. You can almost see like a Kermit the Frog hand. There's nothing in it. I'll bring it back forward. There it is. The issue was Mr. Reeves hit in the face by Olson with his fist. You had both Dr. Adams and Dr. Throckmorton opine on that. Dr. Adams said, yeah, that little red mark might cause that. What did Dr. Throckmorton say on that issue along with the phone too? Glasses. Hello, glasses. Dr. Throckmorton also indicated that after 2 hours, he would expect to see some type of swelling on the face of Mr. Reeves. He did admit, to give weight to his testimony, that he does not deal with live individuals. He deals with the deceased. That's true. But he gave his opinion as to that there was no swelling in that area. The next issue, Judge, is was Nicole Olson trying or did she fail to restrain her husband, Mr. Olson? Now, Mr. Reeves, in his statement to law enforcement, on page 80 and on page 84 of the statement, and his wife is holding him back, and so he jumps up. Page 84, his wife was talking. Whoever was with him was trying to hold him back. So what do we hear for the first time from Mr. Reeves on January 13th, when he testified? Nicole was standing up beside her husband the whole time, almost barrel hugging, if you will, a little over exaggeration, I know. But the point was that she was up and trying to physically hold him for that entire 12 seconds. That was his testimony. And you know what else he said? They were arguing. They were arguing. They had a conflict. And I asked him, I pressed him with Detective, when he made that statement to Detective Proctor, did you tell him that? Didn't think it was important. It's important now, you told us now. Why wasn't it important back then? He acknowledged that he knew it, and he said the reason he didn't say because it wasn't important, but now it is. Judge, I'm going to go back to where we see Mr. Olson. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. We see Mr. Olson in the frame for the first time. You can make your own determination of the position of Mr. Olson at that time. But what did Mrs. Olson say? Mrs. Olson said she didn't see the toss of the popcorn, but she was seated next to her husband, you know about my job. And he was turned in face because she's right-handed. She's getting up, so she reaches over. And as she begins to lift her buttocks off the chair, with her hand over, she feels the hot pain. She doesn't know how far she is up from the chair, but she's in the process of standing, and when she feels the pain of the gunshot, she continues to stand and draws the hand back. At which point, her husband turns towards her, makes a turn, walks, and collapses. That's her testimony. Both Dr. Adams and Dr. Thogmartin told you that that was a viable scenario. As Dr. Adams would say, that was a yay or a nay, that was a yay. Like this. Because her hand is parallel here. The whole purpose, oops. You want to come around, Richard? The whole purpose of this beach video, the only purpose, is to show the height disparity between Mr. and Mrs. Olson. You can make a determination of whether it's significant or not, but you can see the difference. They're both barefooted, so it's fairly accurate, not one in high heels and one not, the height difference. And you can see that her shoulder is almost right at his diaphragm, and the wound is right up here. She is not tall enough to take her left hand and place it over his shoulder and get her hand in the position that it was when she was shot. Because of the height difference between the two, the only way that Mrs. Olson can accomplish the task of placing her hand in harm's way to get shot is if Chad Olson is down somewhat and she's coming up somewhat. If he's standing fully erect, she would have to be all the way up here and we'd be at an angle. He has to be down. He has to be. He's not standing fully erect. The wound has to be somewhere from the top of his chair up to fully erect. But as Dr. Thogmartin pointed out, it was not fully erect. As she's coming up, it has to line up that when he is shot, the wrist, her hand, her chest, the chest wound has to be in line. And the only way that Chad Olson's chest can be this far off the ground if he is significantly lower. That's the reason for this photograph, so you can see that that's the way it would have to occur. Miss Olson was not facing Mr. Reeves when she was shot. She was not standing up in a bear hug against her husband, with her husband, trying to keep him from going over the seat. The evidence is consistent with what Dr. Adams said yay to and Dr. Thogmartin said was consistent. At the time of the shot, his chest was low, she was coming up, and her hand was over. The height disparity between the two limits the possibilities in which The shot could hit his wrist, her hand, and her chest in the manner in which we find the wounds. Was there an escalating pattern of violence by Mr. Olson against Mr. Reeves? There's a throwing a cell phone according by the defense. There was a reaching in and grabbing for popcorn and then reaching back in. Let's just assume for a minute that there was an escalating pattern of violence. Here's what it would look like, Judge. You'd have the toss of the phone like a cue ball, baseball, gotta hurt. And you escalate that by paper bag with fluffy popcorn in it. Escalating pattern of violence. If it occurred the way the defense team suggests. Was Mr. Reeves' eyeglasses knocked askew on his face? Now, I touched upon that briefly, Judge, but that's kind of critical because that goes hand in hand with the askewing of the eyeglasses had to occur at the time that he was struck. And it's a little convoluted, but I got to pull them apart. It's like a stew. I got to talk about the corn before the peas. So let me talk about the glasses. The glasses askewed is because he was hit with something. When it occurred, that's where the analogy by the defense team gets a little loosey. Was it 12 seconds before? Was it when he reached in? According to Mr. Reeves, you recall, I was stretched fully out. He was almost on top of me. I saw a blur of a phone. I got hit, my glasses were skewed, I shot upward, had to be almost a contact wound. That was his statement to Detective Proctor. Well, just take that statement. At that time, it's the toss of the popcorn, court recalls. Because at that time, and it's the only time you've seen from the video that Mr. Reeves is, quote, fully stretched out, according to the defense, trying to create distance. So when you couple those facts together, Mr. Reeves says, when I'm fully stretched out, he sees the blur of a cell phone. Well, that's 8 seconds after when we have the alleged throwing of the cell phone. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Pick one or the other. It can't be both. You can't get hit by the cell phone and lose it. Then all of a sudden, Mr. Olson has retrieved it, and by golly, I got it in my hand. Now I'm going to toss popcorn on you with the phone back in my hand that I just hit you with in the side of the head. It doesn't make any sense. So that's where we get to the glasses, where the glasses are skewed when the cell phone boomeranged around and hit him in the side of the head. If he was facing forward, you're hitting this side. So he's got to be turned, but even if he turned, he can't. When were the glasses askewed? Were they askewed at all? And does it make any sense? Like I demonstrated, for that 12-second period, we got glasses askewed, and he does nothing in order to adjust his glasses whatsoever for those 12 seconds. In fact, he leans forward and does whatever he needs to do with Mr. Wilson. He comes back and he's settled in. He still leaves his glasses askewed on his face. He then sees Mr. Olson at his point coming over the seat, climbing over into his lap. He pulls his gun and fires. Then he sits back down and goes, oh man. Does that make any sense? Were the glasses askewed? Well, I think we can conclude that's a good possibility. When the popcorn bag hit the side of his face and knocked him around a little bit. But that's about it. I'm going through these points because I want you to keep in mind that these are the defendant's statements. And whether or not his statements is corroborated by the evidence or even common sense goes to his credibility. And please keep in mind, Judge, that as I go through these, that his credibility is an issue. Because just like Mr. Escobar ended with his closing with Dr. Hayden, Dr. Hayden said, I believe he was reasonable. Dr. Hayden's opinion was based solely on the self-serving statements of Mr. Reeves. And you heard on cross, I asked him if any of those statements were proved to be wrong, like he was hit with a cell phone or fist. That's not true. Would that call your opinion into question? And you recall his response. We get into the most contentious aspect of this case, I guess. The next issue was Mr. Olson over his seat back when Reeves shot him. So, let me start off with some concepts, because it's kind of interwoven with the next couple of issues. Perception disorder. We heard about that. So what is it? It's how someone perceives something based on their life experience, the environment they find themselves in. Whatever those conditions are, a lot of things can affect one's perception of what's going on. And we went through all of those issues. But the bottom line, perception disorder is very it's very unique to an individual. All right? You have to rely on what Mr. Reeves tells you is his perception. And if the credibility of Mr. Reeves is called into question, then you have to determine what you're going to believe and what you're not going to believe. So let's talk about perception disorder. What I'd like to do is point out those things that it does not involve, in my opinion, for your consideration. Perception disorder would not include my glasses are skewed. That's facts. It's either there, he said he put them on. There's no perception involved. They were skewed. I perceive they were skewed, so it's not a disorder. Okay? Now, whether or not it occurred or not, we've already discussed that and when. But that's not a perception disorder. Pain to the head from a fist cell phone. You don't have phantom pain. You don't perceive phantom pain. In a high-stress situation, you don't go, oh, shoot, my nose hurts. All right? You either feel the pain or you don't. You either feel it or you don't. That's not a perception disorder in a high-stress situation, whether or not you feel pain. Mr. Reeves testified over and over, he felt pain in the side of his face, left temporal area. He can't account for that as a perception disorder. It either happened or it didn't happen. And that goes to his credibility. Whether or not his hand was on Mr. Olson's chest or shoulder. Now he mentioned in Detective Proctor's statement that as his version, as Mr. Olson came over the seat, he actually put his hand out and was touching his shoulder or his chest, going, whoa, 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 or no, no, no. For your own consideration, Judge, perception disorder, a little too many details. I had my hand on him, I could feel it, and then I'm responding, whoa, 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 no, no, no. Another thing to consider, whether or not that is a perception disorder, maybe it really didn't happen because of high stress, he just thought it did. What did he say to Detective Proctor? I had my left hand out in front of me, and when I pulled my gun up and he was stretched back, my hand was out in front. I was lucky I didn't shoot my own hand. I'm taught as a law enforcement officer, do not put my hand in the muzzle, in front of the muzzle of the firearm. He went on, and I offer this to you for your consideration. He went on to explain to Detective Proctor why Detective Proctor should believe that his hand was up there, holding Mr. Olson off, going, whoa, 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 explaining to him, by golly, I knew my hand was out there, and I'm lucky I didn't shoot it. So he went into detail, trying to corroborate his statement to Mr. Olson. You don't do that with a perception disorder. If you perceive something that didn't really happen, and you can attribute it to a perception disorder. You don't go on and on trying to explain it to someone so they will believe you. Perception disorder does not include the body position as specifically as testified by Mr. Reeves. He indicated that he was fully stretched out, he was leaning to the left, he drew his pistol, and while he was stretched out, he fired. Page 81 of Mr. Reeves' statement. I'm leaning back in my chair, so he kept on hollering, and I'm not sure of what he said, to be honest with you. He said something odd that led me to believe he was going to kick my ass. I didn't know if that's exactly how he phrased it or not, so I'm looking briefly. I know I can't go anywhere, so I'm leaning all the way back in my chair as far as I can get away from him, and suddenly he's virtually on top of me because I'm stretched out. And he goes on to explain how the pants, and you've got to be stretched out to get the gun out of your pants. Mr. Reeves goes on to say, page 85 of his statement, and I'm going to just paraphrase, but you can look at the statement and see where I'm getting this information. Mr. Reeves says, his feet were on the seat, at least one of them. He was pushing back with his hand and was coming over the seat. And I'm saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. Mr. Reeves went on to explain, I was saying no, 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 or whoa, whoa, whoa. So he's coming over on me. And I'm pushing him off with my left hand, and I had a hold of something. I'm assuming it was probably his chest. Mr. Reeves asked, which hand? My left hand. Mr. Reeves explains, I made contact with something, his arm, his chest, or shoulder, I don't know. But I'm saying whoa, 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 or no, no, no. Let's look at the video, because at this point in time, Judge, there are no breaks in the video. This is a solid video. You heard what Mr. Reeves said. I was stretched fully out when I shot him. The next issue, Judge, is what was the conduct of Mr. Olson after the toss of the popcorn? And we're going to go back to what we just witnessed on the video screen for another analysis. All right. I'm at 13:26:30, and this is just before we see Mr. Olson's head come into the scene. Judge, what I'd like for you to do for this part of the analysis, I'd like to consider, if you would, consider using this black line, which is the frame, as a straight edge. And it's going to be a similar analysis like they would do with a golfer, whether or not he's actually pivoting and it's a one swinger, you know what I mean. So that's what we're going to use it for, just so we can orientate body position. Now, everyone agrees that we don't know exactly where this line is in three-dimensional space, where the chair is in relation to Mr. Olson or to Mr. Reeves. But what we can tell from this frame is at 13:26:35 is the first frame that we see Mr. Olson. Judge, you can look at the frame and decide for yourself to what extent Mr. Olson's head is in the frame. But that is critical for the analysis that I'd like to go through with you. Because what was said is that Mr. Olson was climbing over the seat. He was in my lap. I was so afraid he was coming over the seat, and I had to, I was trying to distance myself from him. I want you to watch where his head is. You see Vivian moving right here. You see the arm come in. Now there's his head when we first see it. Now watch his head as he reaches. First reach. By the time that the popcorn is back by his head so he can flick it, what do we see in that straight line? Now, we don't know his body position in the dark, but what we do know, Judge, he wasn't in the frame. If you look where he started, at 13:26:35, I'd like for you to consider, Judge, and make your own determination. Is that the closest that Mr. Olson ever got to Mr. Reeves? I want you to watch the video and watch his head. We're going to play it through. We have the popcorn back. You do not see his head. Popcorn comes forward. All you see is right above his elbow. You do not see his head. The popcorn is released, and you do not see his head. What you see is the retreat of Mr. Olson as he brings his hand back. He never closes the gap on Mr. Reeves. The closest that Mr. Olson ever got is when he first stood up. In fact, he was further away from Mr. Reeves when he actually grabbed the popcorn. And from the time that he grabbed the popcorn, his movement was backwards. And release and out of frame. Not forward, but backwards. And I offer that for your consideration. You can make your own determination. But at that point, Mr. Olson is in retreat. After doing what? The most benign thing you can do is throw a fluffy bag of popcorn at somebody. He was in retreat. After doing that. Rude and disrespectful? You bet. One guy doing that to another guy may as well pour a good cold beer over his head. And just as rude and disrespectful. That's what it was. The next issue, Judge, I'd like to discuss with you is what was Mr. Olson's body position when he was shot. We're going to go back to 13/26/35 and use those frames where there's no break. There's no break whatsoever. What was his body position? We already have the testimony of Nicole as to where she was. And we know how her hand has to be in front of his chest and he has to be much lower. But what was the body position? For your consideration, if you would watch, starting at 13/26/35, as Mr. Olson does not increase his distance, but decreases his distance from Mr. Reeves as the popcorn is tossed. You can see his hand. Remember the testimony of Dr. Vern Adams and Dr. Throckmorton. When the shot is fired, numerous things have to take place. First of all, Mr. Olson's chest has to be at a location that, based on his height, would allow a much shorter Mrs. Reeves, as she's coming up from her seat, to place the hand in front of his chest. Before the shot is fired, Mr. Olson's body, whatever he's flexing at the hips or the knees, he has the knee in the seat, it doesn't matter, but it has to be in a position. It has to be turned. His right hand has to come, as we see in the video frame. It has to keep traveling. It has to travel. It can be out here, but we see it moving. It's not shot, it's not shot. It has to get in its position. Simultaneously, Ms. Olson's hand has to come up and be in position to whatever it is. So when the shot's fired, you have muzzle, first target, second target, chest. It has to line up. Those movements have to take place before the shot is fired. So as we look at 13/26/35, 36, and 37, that's what we see here. You see his hand coming back. And as it leaves the frame, you do not see his hand there. I invite your attention, Judge, to this area right here. I'm going to play it back just so you can orientate yourself. When the hand is right there, I suggest to the court, for your own determination, that the gun is drawn and being pressed forward towards Mr. Olson. 1 frame, 2 frames, 3 frames, hand is out, 1 more frame, right there is the gun. It has to be. When I play it forward, you'll see, as it comes forward, 1 frame, 2 frames, 3 frames. When you do the critical view and you track what you see along with movement, then the movie gives content. And that's why it's so important to keep these still frames moving. You just can't look at 1 frame and tell what's going on. So right here we have the gun is out, gun is out, gun is out, and it is fired. All that time, Mr. Olson is going backwards. We see that clearly from the video. It is Mr. Reeves that is pressing forward and increasing his distance between himself and Mr. Olson, not the other way around. Mr. Reeves was not in a defensive posture, he was in an offensive posture. And I'll explain that in a moment. So what was his position? Both medical examiners were in agreement. They were in agreement that the possible body positions are limited by the known circumstances and witness testimony. And those known circumstances were the artifacts within the theater themselves. The seatback was not shot. Now, I'm not 6'5", 6 foot, so I'm going to do like Dr. Throckmorton, just put it a little bit higher, about 5 inches. We have to be in this position. Now, can we be here? That'll work. Can we be here? That'll work. Can we be here? That'll work. Let's go down a little bit further. Can we be here? That'll work. Look at the video. Now look at this position. In order for the gunshot to be straight across, he can be in this position. But we can also look at the evidence to further restrict the possibilities. Look at the frame. Look at this position. Will this work? Look at the frame. Look at the position. The position that I just demonstrated, Judge, Dr. Fern Adams, their forensic pathologist, said yay to that one. Dr. Throckmorton did all his possibilities. You saw him. That was the possibility. And you saw Corporal Hamilton. He didn't know where the legs were, but he was propped up. He was down, but he was propped up. And then what did he say? I don't know where his legs were. I don't know what his position was. But after the shot, he stood up. And by golly, was he tall. After Mr. Olson was shot in that position, there was no exaggerated step back over the seat like we heard from Matt Reeves, suggesting that Mr. Olson was over here and somehow after shot in the heart came back over his seat and staggered down. That didn't happen. Matt Reeves said, I heard my dad's voice. Get out of my face. Mr. Reeves' statement to law enforcement. Mr. Reeves said, Mr. Olson said, get out of my face. What was Mr. Reeves' state of mind when he shot Mr. Olson? That is the burning question. Let's assume for a minute that you take the approach that the defense team wants. Throw out all the witnesses. Just throw them out. Let's take that approach. What kind of analysis would that lead you to? You would have the video. You would have Mr. Reeves' statement, both to law enforcement and on the stand. And that's where we get to the credibility issues, the perception. In order to give any weight to Dr. Hayden's opinion, you would have to determine and believe Curtis Reeves. The old adage, garbage in, garbage out. And that's what Dr. Hayden admitted. The perceptions that were described to you by Mr. Reeves, you would have to believe. We can't just open up his head. I forget which witness said you just can't open up the head and find the scary part, where it's scared. You can't do that. You have to go by what the person said. And then you go back and try to corroborate the facts that maybe would corroborate the perception. But that's not what we have here. Mr. Reeves engaged in an act of misdirection, misleading, weaving embellishments and lies into his statement to the law enforcement to achieve a goal. The differences between his statement in court and to law enforcement cannot be accounted for a perception disorder. Mr. Reeves went into too many details, an explanation of those details that he wants now to wash away under the guise of a perception disorder. So let's look at some of the things we can look at to determine the credibility of Mr. Reeves, because that goes to his state of mind. There's been testimony by Mr. Reeves that when he returned from the manager that Mr. Olson gave him an agitated stare, I believe was the term used. First time he said that was on the stand. You can take that in consideration. You can take in consideration the motivation of a police officer who is firmly aware of use of force. He knows all the buzzwords. He knows the terms. He knows how to spin the web. You have to take that into consideration. And one way you can determine if my last statement was true for your consideration is his explanation about the popcorn. Page 89 of his statement regarding the popcorn, I'm not sure if I dropped it or if he knocked it out of my hand. I don't know. Page 90 of his statement, and then I straightened out my glasses. We already covered that. I saw the popcorn on the floor. I saw a cell phone right in front of me. I thought it was mine, though apparently it was his. And I'm thinking that's kind of what hit me. Page 90 of his statement. Let's analyze that just for a moment. Mr. Reeves knows, and he admitted that he knew, that the use of force is to prevent an intimate act that could cause great bodily harm, death, or to prevent a forcible felony. You've seen the video. The popcorn didn't miss. It went right into his head area, went down to his feet. Perception disorder so focused on Mr. Olson that he didn't know popcorn just went down his face. But instead, he thought he was hit by a fist. We can't wash that away by he was so focused in tunnel vision. We have Mr. Reeves who sat there for a time looking down at his feet. I see popcorn. I see cell phone. What did Mr. Reeves say when he pulled his pistol? What did you tell Detective Proctor? He said, I was fully stretched out. I had my hand up. Whoa, whoa, no, no. At that point, I saw the blur of a cell phone when he was stretched out. Saw the blur. And then he shot. Do the circumstances suggest that Mr. Olson dropped his cell phone when he was shot, or that 12 seconds earlier he threw a boomerang cell phone at him and hit him in the side of the head? That's for your consideration, Judge. We heard for the first time that was not in his law enforcement statement that Nicole was standing up the whole time. And every time Mr. Olson opened his mouth, she was holding him back. Chad and Nicole were arguing the whole time, having a conflict. First time we heard that. had to have a reason for that contact after the, quote, alleged cell phone. So what did he spin there? He had an agitated stare. Therefore, I wanted to calm the environment. I felt it necessary to make sure we all had an enjoyable movie experience, to reach out to him, say something to him. Or was it his statement that after I was hit with the cell phone, I was trying to get up and get out of the way and found that was a bad idea? For your consideration. We've heard so much about the lighting conditions over and over. Was it dark? What is dark? Dark is, I'm going to suggest to the court, is as subjective as the word pretty. I don't know. Dark is dark, pretty is pretty. Everyone's going to come in here, and you could no way go back and recreate what their interpretation of dark was. But that's what we were dealing with. It was a dark that doesn't matter. You were in the theater. You saw for yourself exactly what the lighting conditions were. And now you're able to judge the credibility of the witness that were able to say, I could see, I couldn't tell if it was a Rolex watch, but I could tell if it was a watch. I could tell flip-flops from shoes. I could see people drinking. I could see people talking. I couldn't make out the pierced earring, but I could see a nose and a face. See where I'm getting at, Judge? You can see enough detail to interpret the conduct of individuals. But I think what is most important in judging the credibility of Mr. Reeves is why the lack of acknowledgement that popcorn was tossed in his face. Why the lack of acknowledgement that I saw a hand come in, I saw a hand come in. That's not what he says. He wants to embellish it. He wants to embellish the conduct of Mr. Olson and diminish his conduct. He embellished the conduct of Mr. Olson by not describing popcorn, but by describing a fist or being hit with a cell phone. Because he knew that just being hit by popcorn, can't believe I'm going to say this, just wouldn't fly. Those are the things you can take into consideration as far as the credibility, because now you have to decide his perception and what was his state of mind. The statements I suggest to the court, not only to law enforcement and to Your Honor during his testimony, was very self-serving, meant to mislead and misdirect the police, the court, to achieve his goal, convincing not only Your Honor but the police that the shooting was justified. His training and his background allowed him to spin that web. Having popcorn tossed on him just did not justify the shooting after the fact. He had to embellish the conduct of Mr. Olson in order to have any attempt to convince anyone that he should not be held liable for the murder of Chad Olson. Telling police that he was stretched out to create distance between himself and Mr. Olson was one such embellishment, to show that he was in such dire strait, that this man was virtually on top of him, that his back was against the wall, that he was doing all he could do as a 71-year-old man to hold this 200-pound man off of him. He shot him. He shot him because he was holding up a 200-pound man. That's the embellishment that he spun in an attempt to convince authorities and this court that he is not responsible for the death of Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson was not virtually on top of him. He was not fully stretched out when he shot Mr. Olson. His gun was not up at an upward angle. What did Mr. Reeves? He and I had a discussion about index shooting and instinctive shooting. Remember that? He schooled me on, we don't call it index, it's instinctive. Okay, that's fine. Well, what is it? It's shooting without looking at your sights. And we talked about how I can place my finger at that deputy's nose, and if I close my eyes, my finger is just about right under his nose. And he acknowledged that. That's what it is. It's just being able, being nerd deputy. Here, and I can almost go like this, as long as my focus is on his center mass, I'm going to hit it. No question about it. I don't have to look down the sights. The importance of that is what did Mr. Reeves do? And of course, this is the only thing that is important. This is the height of the chair. So if he's here, whatever, what did he say? He was looking at center mass. And he came up, and he pressed forward, and he fired. Let me just show you. Richard, you want to come around? This all goes in line. Now, where was Mr. Olson? Was he in that aggressive stance? If you look at 13:22:35, contact with Olson before complaining to the manager. That was the second time. If you look at his body position, contact with Mr. Olson after complaining to the manager. That's his body position. He's talking to Mr. Olson while he's seated in the seat. When he fired, that is his body position. He was looking at center mass. He was instinctive shooting. I'll leave it for your consideration where Mr. Olson's body was. But you know where his shot was? Just like Mr. Reeves agreed. The widest part of the body is right below the armpit. And where was Mr. Olson's shot? Right in the heart. Center mass, the widest part of the body. Mr. Olson was low. He was retreating. He was going backwards. The video clearly disputes whatever statements by Mr. Reeves that he wants to wash away under the theory of perception disorder. So what are we left with? We left where I started. Retaliation. An action of harming someone because they have harmed oneself. Throw popcorn in my face, will you? Three witnesses by my count, you can rely on your own recollection, had statements attributed to Mr. Reeves contemporaneous with the firing of the pistol. Whether it's right before, during, right after. It was so contemporaneous the witnesses were having a hard time separating when that took place. When we talk about witness contamination adds. It doesn't subtract. Witness contamination doesn't result in the lack of information. It results in acquiring more information. But if the information is out there, it was out there. And whether it was 1 people, 2 people, 3 people, based on the theory of witness contamination, it was out there. Now, all 3 explained where they were, what they were doing, and why they made that. Now, Mr. Escobar wants you to take it one step further and say because some people were lamenting about being upset all over popcorn, ruined my day. Mr. Cummings ruined my birthday all over popcorn. He wants you to make the leap of logic that now 3 people are going to say, okay, throw popcorn in my face, will you? Well, that doesn't make any sense. You can't make that leap. You can't have people moaning and being upset about their day being ruined all over popcorn, and therefore we throw out everyone's testimony. Now, I know Mr. Escobar has a lot of other theories about why there was witness contamination and exactly what went on, and that's for your own consideration. But I'm suggesting to the court that we have 3 individuals who did not use the exact same words, did not attribute it to exact time, but the bottom line, they all attributed it to Mr. Reeves. Throw popcorn in my face with you, bang. That, Judge, is retaliation. That is knowing that that cell phone on the floor did not hit you in the face. That is knowing that you were not hit in the face by Mr. Olson. That's knowing that popcorn was thrown on you. Popcorn. Because Mr. Olson was in full retreat, and we can see it from the video. I mean, even at the start of the toss, his body's out. He's going backwards. And we don't know how far back, Judge, but he ain't going forward. He's going backwards. No question about that. We know that the stiffling on the hand, there's many reasons for the stiffling not to be from the knuckles to the fingers. That was all explained. But think of the logic. Think of the logic. Remember the logic I said, is there a pattern of, escalating pattern of violence? I throw a cell phone, now I throw a paperback. That doesn't make any sense. Think about Mr. Olson. What did he do? He chose the most benign thing to tell this gentleman, leave me alone, and he takes a bag of fluffy popcorn and tosses it in his direction. And he's backing up, he's done. Does it make any sense that that first choice is the bag of popcorn? Now he's standing back there going, now I'm going to beat the crap out of you. When he had full opportunity, you can see where his hand is. Didn't take much. If he wanted to do it, he would have done it at that time. It doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense that after tossing a bag of popcorn, does someone conclude that now you're going to get hit with the fist, not when the person's backing up. It just doesn't make any sense. That's why Mr. Reeves had to say, I was hit with the fist. He wasn't. He knows it. He knows he shot him because he felt it was disrespectful for being hit with a bag of popcorn. Retaliation. The action of harming someone because they have harmed oneself. What was harmed? His ego. Another man being constantly disrespectful, refusing to yield to his orders. Mr. Reeves created the hostile environment he found himself in. The hostile environment had dissolved by the time he returned from the manager, but he kept the hostility flames burning by the unnecessary and non-consensual contact with Mr. Olson, who by now was a man Mr. Reeves knew wanted no contact with him. But he had a gun in his pocket. The great equalizer, the compensator. When Mr. Reeves shot Mr. Olson was in retreat. It was Mr. Reeves that was pressing forward. There was no imminent threat. All the events were over. During my opening statement, I used the analogy of the Goldilocks rule. When we talk about self-defense, you can't be too early, you can't be too late. You have to be just right. You have to be just right. And it's tough. I mean, anyone who carries a firearm in the state of Florida, including Mr. Reeves and everybody else, they all have that responsibility, including Mr. Reeves. If you're going to make that call, you better be right. Because it's a fine line sometimes. Too early? It's not imminent. Someone's going to have to decide. Too late? You can't shoot at the car driving away. It has to be just right. When Mr. Olson was in retreat, it was too late. Retaliation, the action of harming someone because they have harmed someone, they have harmed oneself. I'm going to use the term that Mr. Reeves used. He said he was scared shitless. For your consideration, Judge, I submit to you that being scared shitless after an event is over does not justify a shooting. Your Honor, I provided one way to conduct your analysis. You may choose all, choose your own, but please conduct the analysis and look and decide for yourself. And I believe that once you've conducted your own analysis, either independently or with the assistance of myself, or even Mr. Escobar, that you will find that in this particular case, the defendant has not met his burden. The defendant has provided insufficient evidence to find that he is entitled to immunity for the shooting of Chad Olson. Judge, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. All right, we have reached the end. Are there any other matters that we need to address before I take this under advisement? Everything's in evidence. Gentlemen, do you wish to review the evidence?
Judge, I think we're fine. I think there's one right down here that needs to be given to the clerk,
Okay,
but we got to put the phone in here first.
correct. I think there's a couple things floating around. Oops. All right. Other than that, as I indicated, I'll take this under advisement. I will have a written order by Friday, next Friday, no later than 3 o'clock. No, we've been here enough. And that, that's okay, but all it's going to be is I'm going to give you the order, so I'd just as soon email it to counsel, and then once I've done that for sure, I'll email a copy to Mr. Thompson, our court rep, media rep, and we'll go from there.
Thank you for your time, Your Honor. We really appreciate it. I know it's been a long 2 weeks.
It has been a long 2 weeks, and as I've said before, my participation is a fraction of what all of the council in this case have done. So I'm very mindful of that. I know you guys have all, and gals, have all worked very hard for a long time. So, and I must say, rarely have I had the opportunity to work with such a professional bunch, and I appreciate that, and I mean that. We've had a few moments, but over the last few months, but all in all, that's to be expected in an adversarial system when you have tempers flaring sometime, and but everybody did really well. I really appreciate it, and it was a pleasure, and I must say I will be happy to be on my way today. I am not anticipating being in the office on Monday, but that may change. Other than that, I'll be in the office every week. My assistant is out on vacation next week, so I'm sure I'll have somebody filling in, but if there's anything that you need, keep that in mind. Keep calling or keep whatever you need to do, but I'll be there somewhere. I have no hearings next week that I'm aware of. I don't have any trials, I know that.
You can get it on for another week.
Well, I wasn't going to make that well known, but no, I knew that on Wednesday that we would not have anything in worst case scenario, but you've all done very well with your positions. Anything else we need to address? Oh, yes. Well, no.
There is one matter that we approach.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
All right, and one last thing. I know everyone's let me know of intentions either way, so I don't see much point in setting a pretrial. So,
I think maybe a status check for in March. That way all parties can just make a decision based on whatever.
okay.
Got it.
All right. Let's see. What do I have? Ms. Sumner, do you know, do I have private pretrials March 30th? I think I do too. Let's go March 30th at 9, status check. I don't necessarily need anyone present. We'll check where we're at that time, and if I need to, I can set something at that time.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be in recess until further action. Thank you, everybody.
All right.